So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned in Israel. Israel's experience in terms of water is highly idiosyncratic. I don't think there's other countries that have faced the same kind of challenges that we have and have reached the same sort of solutions that we have. So we'll be doing that, talking about that a bit today. But I want to give it in a broader context, because when we talk about water in water-scarce regions like the Middle East, there is a tendency to be alarmist. The gentleman in front of you is the Boutros Ghali, used to be the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Secretary General, and he was very fond of saying, hang on, what is this? No, I think we're leaving that on. He was very fond of saying that the next wars of the century will be about water. And indeed, you have a long history of people who are very concerned that such a fundamentally resource that is growing increasingly scarce will be the subject of tensions. This is something which has concerned a lot of people. Over the years, I've become rather complacent about this particular issue, and that's because of the work of this gentleman, Aaron Woolf, who's a friend and colleague from Oregon State University. And Aaron, for his doctoral research, put together a database already in 1997 of 286 transboundary drainage basins from around the world. And what he found was that although water scarcity can exacerbate existing conflicts, they do not end up as full-scale wars. And in fact, the only case that he could show where there was a war took place some 3,000 years ago. But nonetheless, it does highlight what is a classic debate in the environmental fields between two ways of seeing the world. The first way are the views of the cornucopians. Cornucopians are otherwise known as Prometheans, people who are fundamentally technologically optimistic. So they would argue that water ultimately is not finite, something we know how to make more of, that we're not going to overuse our resources, that we can solve problems of scarcity. It's just another technical problem, and that if we just utilize existing technologies, we'll be just fine. What we need to know is that water should be a source of collaboration and cooperation, and working with some sort of a creativity and conscientiousness, we can actually be just fine in the water. Now, on the other side of the fence are the Malthusians, or the neo-Malthusians. Everybody remembers the economist and preacher from England, Thomas Malthus, and they take a look at the water situation in the world, and they get nervous. They're like Boutros Ghali. They say there's a growing scarcity of fresh water. Less and less water is available to people, and that with population growing, demand is growing increasingly, so you have a situation where there's contamination of resources, increase in demand, and the shortages are going to ultimately be manifested in conflict, violence, and the like. And the question is, who's right? This is an interesting question. The Aral Sea, of course, is a case study which would favor the Malthusians, those people who are concerned about the pervasiveness of shortage in the world. I think everybody in the water forum knows this great tragedy, water diversion by the Soviet Union, which left a great shortage of water in the Aral Sea, and you can see it's slow but steady shrinking. I think Al Gore started his book Earth in the Balance with a description of the desert, which once was a lake, and the fishing industry, which was basically evaporated overnight. And here is indeed a sad case of this. Here's some pictures from the Aral Sea to give us a sense of what it means when an entire community and almost a region have to find another place to live because they ran out of water. Lake Chad is another case where we see massive disappearance of water resources. This is the second largest lake in Africa, and you can see it's basically been reduced to a puddle as a result of diversion of water and the like. And so the question is these kind of terrible sagas ineluctable? Are we locked into a pathology of scarcity and famine and loss? Okay, here's some pictures from Lake Chad. So it was 25,000 square miles, today a tenth of that, and this. So one of the arguments that says that we can avoid these kinds of disasters is if we have adaptive management. If we're only the Soviet Union, not a centrally managed area, they would have realized in time what was happening, and they would have adjusted their water management policies. And so this notion of adaptive management has come in as a very, very popular strategy for addressing the management of national and regional water resources. And basically, the idea is you want to let the core of this be scientists who are monitoring the hydrological situations. You look at the situation as an experiment. You don't come in and know in advance exactly what the results are going to be, and you follow it closely, and by monitoring and evaluating your efforts, and at some point you try to see what's working, what isn't, and you make the necessary changes, and you develop a framework where there can be serious interactions between scientists, people monitoring, regulators, legal experts, and the like, and of course the whole process being participatory, allowing people who actually live there and have to live with the consequences to be part of it. And so this model of adaptive management is considered one of the ways, or the antidote for those kind of hydrological disasters which I described earlier. However, I'm not so sure that our experience with adaptive management is always as sanguine and as successful as we'd like it to be. And there's no shortage of water systems which have embraced this or that model of adaptive management, which have not produced happy results. The Colorado River and the Columbia Rivers over here, the Everglades also is a mess, despite their attempts to do adaptive management. The Rio Grande, of course, the Ogallala Aquifer, something I've been hearing about for many, many decades, ever since I first started studying water and water form. Perhaps I don't need to talk about too much, but for those who are unfamiliar, the Ogallala Aquifer, the United States' largest aquifer, starts in Texas, goes all the way up way past Nebraska. Here's some pictures of the agriculture that it does. But for years, they've been saying that the water level in the aquifer is dropping slowly but surely, and eventually it's going to be too expensive to pump. And this year, actually this year, 2014, I was giving a lecture at Texas Tech, and which is based out there right in the middle of Lubbock, Texas, in the middle of the Ogallala Aquifer. And sure enough, this past summer it happened when farmers went out to pump water, and there was nothing there. And a whole economy based on irrigation and crops is going to go back to rangelands because it's becoming too expensive to pump the water out. So Israel could certainly have been such a model. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about the things we did, which I think is a rare case where adaptive management, they didn't call it then in the 1950s, but today we would perhaps characterize the activities in our country strategies as adaptive management, how we manage to respond to the situation. Now, before we do that, it's important to ask some fundamental questions. How much water do we actually need? And of course, Mary Falkenmark set the standard there when she said that everybody needs a minimum of 1,000 cubic meters. For those of you who are metrically challenged, this would be somewhere on the order of 1,000,000 liters or 1,000,000 quarts of water a year for their needs, produce the food, have showers, whatever they might need. And if you have less than that, you are water scarce. You're in a bad situation. If you have 1,700 cubic meters a year, you're only water stressed. It's not good, but at least you can get by. And here's the thing. We know that the world's population is growing. We're going to need a lot more. Well, Israel is a country which has had, from its inception, been a country which has been in water scarce situation, less than that 1,000 cubic meters. These are the water resources which Israel has naturally. Is this a pointer? It is. Excellent. So you can take a look at our major water sources, three major sources of fresh water. We have the coastal aquifer, which runs along the coast. This is the Mediterranean here. This is the Gaza Strip. There's to the north. Then you've got the mountain aquifers, or these ones over here. You can see that green bar, which is an aquifer which is where the water falls largely in the West Bank and flows into Israel. Afterwards, then you have the Jordan or the Kinneret Basin up in the north, our largest fresh water. These are all in thousands of cubic meters. So you have 559,000, a million cubic meters of water, excuse me. And that's the largest one, and you have 295. So this is the water resource situation that we've had in Israel pretty much most of the time that I've been working in the area of water. But here is the problem. Those numbers are no longer valid because in our country, climate change is no longer the pessimistic projections and the gloomy vision of Al Gore. It's a new precipitation hydrological reality. You can see the numbers. Where we used to get 1,509 million cubic meters of water a year, we now have 1,355 million cubic meters of water per year. In the last 17 years, we can see that the amount of water which has been available is significantly lower. We had a couple of drought years in the year 2000 And Lebanon was the largest, the driest we ever had in 2014, January. It did not rain a drop, the driest January ever. This is the peak of our rainy system. Israel has a Mediterranean climate where it's not supposed to rain in the summer, but from about October all the way into the end of April, we expect to get rain. That's how our Jewish calendar is based around that. And yet, the rainiest month of the year did not rain at all. So we face yet new challenges in terms of climate change, in addition to all the other kinds of problems. And the question is, how do you respond to this? And which makes it even more complicated is the fact that the demand for water in Israel has grown geometrically. You can look in 1950, there were 1 million people in the country. In 1960, 2 million people. 1970, 3 million people. And you do the math up to over 8 million people today. This is truly geometric growth in population. And not just Israel's growing at such a rapid pace, our neighbors as well. Take a look at Jordan, 500,000 people in 1950, and it's moving up. And this is before the most recent influx of refugees from Syria, which has added over 1 million people to that country. They took 1 million people in from the Iraq refugee situation. So their water scarcity situation is even much more acute than ours. Palestinians, their population growing very, very rapidly also, all for a finite amount of water that we share together. You can take a look at Egypt also. Syria, well, their demographics have changed, but before that they grew very quickly. So if you take a look at this particular thing, you can see that pretty much most countries many countries in our region are what we would call water scarce, where the amount of resources available are lower than those which are demanded. Take a look, for example, in Yemen with 124% demand over the relative to the 100% that's available, and you can see other countries, Jordan, 150%. That number is even far higher today. So we have a situation of significant water shortages, and Israel's situation is somewhat unique. I want to just focus on Jordan for a second, but you can see where the demand is coming from, largely from agricultural, but you can see this 565 million cubic meter deficit in the water resources. So Israel's also, like I said, besides the fact that it has shortages, it has a fundamental asymmetry, where in the south of Israel you have very little water and high evapotranspiration. This is all millimeters of rain per year, and this map less than 100 down in the south. This is where our university is based, around 250. And then some areas in the north you have as much as 700 or 800, but those are very small. Some 93% of the country is really considered to be dryland arid conditions. So what did Israel do to address the situation? I want to sort of talk about different stages in our hydrological history within this broader context of adaptive management. So the first stage was what we call the water carriers. Again, Israel has this very, very asymmetrical situation, not unlike places like California. A lot of water in the north, very little water in the south. And so what I like to call hydrosocialism, our early political leaders were largely socialist in their perspective, and from their way of saying, folks have a lot of water in the north, they have to share it with those who are poor and are parched in the south. And so we started building water carriers, 3 to be sure, that would take water from the wealthy and bring it down to the water-stressed regions of the south and allow those desert regions to become agriculturally productive. Here's a picture of the national water carrier, actually the Yarkon, the first one coming from the center of the country. The crowning jewel, this was the national water carrier. You can see here a map, excuse me, you can't see anything now, a map of the area here, where water is taken from that Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, the only freshwater lake in the Middle East, and brought down to a national water carrier all the way down to Mitzpeh Ramon, where we take water and share it, where in a national carrier, and you can see a picture of the carrier right there. Here's another photo which gives you a sense of water coming through the country from the Galilee down to the south. In order to alleviate some of the shortages which exist there and allow a country that sought to be much more agrarian and agricultural to produce the food it did. So that was a first stage. It was very, very important in doing that. Now, the trouble, and you can see that what happened is a lot of areas in the desert, which had been written off in terms of agriculture production, became fertile areas. The trouble is that these water areas became, is there a way to turn these off, by the way, with this? No. Okay. So these waters ultimately, these water projects were good, but ultimately it wasn't enough. as the population grew and agricultural production grew, there was still a shortage of water, and people began to think of what they might do to change that. The first person to think about that was a guy named Simcha Blatz, whose picture should be on here, but somehow didn't make the transition. But the idea is that Israel, as the country became more crowded, it stopped using cesspools and septic tanks for sewage and started using centralized sewage centers. And the problem with that was massive pollution. Beaches were closed. We had signs of sewage contamination of groundwater. And they said, let's not look at this as a problem. What they say, that the Chinese character for crisis is also opportunity. Let's see what we might do with this wastewater. And so Israel launched on what became, I think, a fairly unique adventure in wastewater reuse, an effort to take our sewage and turn it into a resource. And the experience is fairly unique, where starting with, this is the Shefdan, all the greater Tel Aviv region's water, it's treated to a secondary level, then tertiary, then it's injected into a aquifer and pumped out a month later as fresh water. So in 1956, a national master plan was there, and they predicted 150 million cubic meters of sewage a year. This is one of the rare instances where our water planners turned out to be too cautious. Usually they tend to overestimate. In fact, by now we have much more than 150 million cubic meters being recycled. We got a major loan, and today, as more and more of the country goes online, about 88% of our sewage is recycled. You can see the number of wastewater treatment plants and the steady growth of advanced treatment in our water systems. So basically, using activated sludge, we can bring our sewage to levels which are reasonable, and now as we reach and bring in newer tertiary standards, tougher standards, we are finding water which is getting close to, not to drinking water, but to certainly water that is allowed to be used for all unlimited irrigation. Now there's, like I said, it's adaptive management. You learn lessons along the way. One of them has to do with boron, okay? Boron was not a chemical which water scientists worried about too much because people drink boron all the time. It's a basic element. We need it. Plants even actually need it. But here's the thing. If you have too much boron, it can be toxic for plants. And you can see pictures of different plants that suffer the toxicity that was caused by boron. And where did boron come from? It came from the wastewater. Well, how come is that? Well, because people were using detergents, and detergents, one of the chemical compounds was boron. And the farmers said, we don't want to recycle sewage anymore because our plants are dying. It's toxic. So this is an example of a fairly simple regulatory magic bullet where Israel could come through with a new policy which basically banned boron in detergents. It's not an essential ingredient. And you can see from the time they did that, I don't know if the dates on this come through, but you can see this is 1996 to 2008. And as a result of those that policy and that intervention, you can see the drop in boron and no longer became a problem for wastewater reuse. So that's the kind of example where while you're managing a water problem, you have to listen and be talking to the stakeholders, and hopefully most of these problems can become overcome. The next stage really became the problem of dealing with the seasonal asymmetry, because it's not just the geographic asymmetry between south and north that was a problem. It was also a problem that Israel, like I said, is a Mediterranean climate. Between the months of May and October, it doesn't rain. Then it rains quite a bit. If you're a farmer, you don't really need to recycle sewage during those rainy months. You want to take the rain and not pay any money, and you'd rather have the fresh water coming from the sky. So what do? People are still flushing their toilets during those months, and moreover, you want the water in the summertime for irrigation when there's nothing coming out. And that's why reservoirs became a central third phase in our water strategy, and this actually was an interesting stage because it involved a partnership between the Jewish National Fund, which is an international public corporation, basically a philanthropic one, where over $2 billion were invested in reservoirs which captured a lot of the wastewater, and 207 billion reservoirs were invested. And yet, it still wasn't enough. We're still shortage. So one of the things that if you notice my sort of discussion of the different stages so far, they have a common denominator. What would that be? They all involve expanding water supply. We know that if you want to reach a balance, it's not just a question of increasing supply, you want to try to cut demand. Demand management should be a part of any sustainable water program, and indeed Israel has, because as you can see in this picture, we've had many drought years in a row, and as a result, here's the water level in the Sea of Galilee, and you can see that red line is a line which hydrologists say we shouldn't be going below because we could lead to salinization of this really critical drinking water reservoir. This, you can see what's happening in 2009. So, like I described, I think that was in the previous class, Israel has an interesting situation where the Jordan River starts up here in Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. The water flows into the Sea of Galilee, okay, the Kinneret Lake. Ultimately, it's pumped out, treated, and the water that naturally is left behind flows down the Dead Sea, okay? But during these drought years, even since then, it didn't make it to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is disappearing. So it looks like a situation where you have lots of water. In fact, the Dead Sea is now losing about a meter of water per year, and that means that when you go visit the Dead Sea today, it's significantly smaller. It seems to be marching in the direction of the Aral Sea, just like I started with that picture. What are we going to do to respond to that? It also manifests itself in collapsed infrastructure, where these large holes in the ground sinkholes are appearing, largely a result of salt dissolving because of underwater flows that didn't exist. Streams are disappearing as well. So even though we had all these additional water, it still became insufficient as we faced the new climate change reality. One of the things we did was we cut back on agriculture. Agriculture water allocations have been dropping, fresh water have been dropping significantly. And overall, we've seen that agricultural allocations have stayed steady even as there's been a 14 times increase in production. So we've been doing that, and that's been through a lot of different areas. So one of the things facing this, they said, well, we need to start thinking about how to deal with that, but in the meanwhile, we still can have desalination. That is the ultimate solution to our water shortage problem, by finding water from the sea and doing that. As you can see, Israel is not the only country in the region which has decided that desalination offers an opportunity. Here is a picture from the Mediterranean. As you can see, countries throughout the region are opting for desal sites. This map is even a little bit old, and you can look at maybe twice the number of facilities. So we're going to have more and more desalination. The areas from the Red Sea, more and more countries and areas finding this the solution, okay? Today there's 17,200 desalination plants worldwide. This is a sea change, pardon the pun, but this is the equivalent of 20 years of rain. Really, we're seeing more and more countries moving to a desal solution. Israel, as always, this extreme case. For those of you not so familiar with the technology, just a second, two different ways basically to do it. You can have distillation, which was an original way. We see that in many countries like Saudi Arabia, where you distill water. I'm in Virginia, so I should compliment Thomas Jefferson, who, when he was president, insisted that there be desalination, distillation mechanisms on all the boats of the Navy. So if ever somebody got shipwrecked, they could distill water from the sea and still do it. So these technologies are not necessarily new, but to do it on such a large scale, of course, is. The other technology is membranes, where using reverse osmosis, you force water through a membrane. The salt and the brine stay on one side, the water goes to the other side. These membranes have been developed, I think, largely, at least originally, at our university, Ben-Gurion University, and they recently emerged as the more cost-effective technology, and pretty much all the new desal plants are using membrane processes. Okay, so reverse osmosis today, and for years it was always talking about competing technologies. It seems like there is a winner in that discussion. Here's a picture of a reverse osmosis plant. You can see the long membranes where very high pressure is put through water, and they go through the plants. Here's a schematic where pretreatment basically gets all the large materials out of the sea, and then it goes through the RO unit, and then the water comes out on the other side. Why has desalination emerged as such a new and next stage in the water management process? Economics. For many years, the standard fee was over $1 for a cubic meter of water. Today we've got it down to 60 cents, depends on how you want to make the full calculations out. And you can see the process that at one point when they made the Ashkelon plant, when the energy was cheaper, they could actually get to 50 cents for 1,000 liters of water. And I want to stop for a second and think about this. Because if I am going to the store here, we'll go over this for just a second, and bought a little bottle of bottled water from Polish business, and how much would it cost me to buy mineral water in the Northern Virginia here for a liter of bottled water? A couple bucks. So think about that. You're talking about 1,000 liters for 50 cents. A price so cheap that even many agricultural operations can afford to buy desalinated water and raise high-end crops like flowers or avocados and the like. Real change in the way we're looking at and thinking about this notion. Okay, here you can see a breakdown of the costs that are associated with that, where you can see where it used to be about over $1. These are in cents, and you can see that the major expenses involved with operation and maintenance and with energy have come down and down and down, and I don't think we've seen the end of that yet. Okay, so this is something that's really a big change. And when the Israeli government was faced with several years of drought back in the late 1990s, these things are cycles, they decided to build 4 desalination plants. They said we want 250 million cubic meters of water. Remember when we started, we get about 1,000, 1,200 a year naturally from rainfall. Now it's up to 510. In other words, we've now increased, by the time the last of the plants go online, our fresh water supply by 50%. By reaching into the sea and using the water. And many people say we're going to have to triple it yet because, as I'm talking about soon, we have Palestinians who need more water, the Jordanians need more water, we're going to have to do more. There's nothing new about that, and since I come from Ben-Gurion University, I would be remiss if I didn't quote from our founding prime minister, after whom our university is named, who envisioned this many years ago, and he wrote in 1956, I think you have a band over it, the purification of seawater by an inexpensive process is not only vital for Israel, it is a necessity for the world. Hundreds of millions of the inhabitants of the great continent in which we live, that's maybe Asia, suffer from lack of food, yet only a small part of the earth's surface is tilled. The irrigation of the desert with purified seawater will appear a dream to many, but less than any other country should Israel be afraid of dreams. So those are the sort of visionary words, and in fact, this is today's reality. If you look at the coast of Israel, you can see these purple boxes involve plants along the Mediterranean Sea, which have pumped us up already over 500 million cubic meters, about 500 million cubic meters of water. So what it means is that we've seen a major shift in the way we look at our water system. I talked at the beginning about hydrosocialism, water coming from the Galilee, from the rich to the north to the south. I think it was 2010 for the first time, they didn't pump any water out of the Kinneret at all. The Sea of Galilee, because it was such a bad drought. And even today, when you can still take some out, the vast majority of water going to the desert is coming from the center of the country, from desal plants along the coast and from the recycled sewage, okay? So this is, again, a shift, a new phase in our water management strategy. Now, there are great benefits of using desalination. We'll talk some of the downsides. But one that we don't think about is the fact that our water is very hard. When you use the natural ones, but when you use desal, and there's really just mostly H2O there, you solve a lot of the problems of scale. I don't know how many of you visited Israel, but we have a chronic problem if you have a tea kettle. Look at the heating element, it gets all this crud on it, and this can be basically avoided completely by having clean water. So we have a better water supply, less withdrawals from natural water bodies. You saw the shortage of streams, and that's because we're pumping all the headwaters of streams. All of a sudden, 500 million cubic meters of water is available. We can start leaving some of the natural springs and let nature begin to restore itself. Like I said, the quality of water is there, and also you should be able to attain agricultural benefits because our natural water, certainly that from the national water carrier, are high in chlorine, and that's not necessarily good for agricultural production. However, there is some concern when you use desalinated water that there's going to be environmental impacts. And one of the problems is the use of anti-scalants. What happens when you push water through a desal membrane, it can clog it up. and we use these chemicals called antiscalants to clear out them, but they're not natural. They're not toxic, but you will release them. And there has been in some of the Gulf countries that used these things, eutrophication, based on the polyphosphates which are present in the antiscalants. And that could be a problem for eutrophication because the phosphates, of course, is a nutrient, whatever. But other ones seem to be better. In Israel, we've done the first series of monitoring, and it doesn't look like the significant problems. We do have a rise in the salinity, because again, this is desalinated water. We concentrate the salt and release it, but that's only for about a kilometer, maximum 2, around the outfalls. The water with the brine comes after the pumping about a kilometer into the sea. And there has not yet been seen any ecological impacts which are of concern, but we're still very early in this experiment. So like I said, in any kind of adaptive management strategy, you want to keep your hand on the pulse. One of the concerns might be that desalination plants will supplant beach space. Israel is a country with only about 200 kilometers of beach space. That's not a lot. We're very crowded. When you take out the military zones and the industrial zones, we don't have enough beach space to frolic and have a good time. What we've done is we've taken our desal plants and embedded them inside of existing infrastructure. This is a picture of the Hadera power plant in the center of the Mediterranean coast. And you would know that based in the middle of that facility there is a desal facility, so that we didn't have to give up any beach space. And so far, and I've worked very hard in environmental activism and coastal preservation, but we haven't lost any beach space yet because of desal. So this is the new master plan which has come out, and as you can see, Israel's going to be made its commitment. We've crossed over, I think, a red line. We now live very, very much on that. Okay. So what's the update from our desal situation? In 2013, 2014, it was a rainy year for much of the year, and the country said, you know what? Costs money to do desalinized water. We're going to not use all our capacity. We'll save the money. Okay. Well, the projection is that this year we're going to use all of our desal capacity for no other reason. Jordan came to Israel and said, listen, we have a shortage. If you can produce more water, we'll buy it. That's the first time that Jordan ever expressed a willingness to purchase such a resource. So this looks to be the case. Economically, this is the update we know now about desal in the country. And I should actually start by saying that I often feel that Israel's water management situation is a fast forward, certainly for places like Southern California or Texas or arid regions around the world. We're doing things that people will do. So right now, we can do, in terms of the marginal cost, 20 cents to produce a cubic meter of water. The largest component is the operation and maintenance, which costs more. The selling price of water today is 60 cents, 70 for the old plants of desalination for 1,000 liters of water. And so if we look at the record, this is the good news. When we look at desal, we can say on the one hand, we haven't lost beach space. That's with the siting, no net beach losses. It doesn't appear that the discharge of the antiscalants in the brine is causing environmental damage. And there is this peace potential, which I'll talk about later. In the world where we live in, where there's sort of a hydrohysteria, there is it diffuses some of that concern. But the downside is that this is a very energy-intensive process. And so for those of us who are concerned about global warming, and I already said that we're seeing the basis, we really don't want to put all of our concerns, all of our technologies in something which is going to increase the greenhouse gases. We want to reduce that. And we don't see the kind of, like we see someone in Australia, solar-powered desal. The other part is vulnerability. First of all, the vulnerability is economics. Because now the price of water is entirely dependent on the price of energy, because that's what you have to do, we could find a situation where water prices can go up very high if that's all our ones. The other vulnerability, of course, is military. As you know, Israel had a sort of a tumultuous summer. Our university was closed for about 6 weeks because we were being bombed by the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. And if they had been a little bit luckier and had managed to hit a few of these water facilities, a significant proportion of our water supply would be out of commission for some time. So we have to be careful about that. Some people would argue that the problem is existential. In other words, it perpetuates a supply-side mentality. This brings us back to this debate between the cornucopians and the Malthusians. But some of the environmentalists say, with some justification, we have spent our lives preaching the good gospel of sustainability and the fact that we live on spaceship Earth with resource constraints. And now you're coming to us and telling us, no problem, we can make as much water as we want. This is not an ethic that we need to perpetuate. We need to show frugalness or whatever. So there's these concerns. The last stage I want to talk about before we open up to questions, perhaps, is this issue of demand management. Because surely we can't continue to grow forever. We have to find ways to reduce the demand. And Israel started this with its, I think, very impressive work in drip irrigation. Drip irrigation, here's some ancient water systems. We used to do irrigation the old way, both in the ancient water tunnels and then using sprinkler systems. These systems are largely artifacts of the past in Israel. Today, we do drip irrigation. This gentleman is Simcha Malthus, where his picture went to, who was our first sort of water commissioner, and when he left to discuss, because he couldn't have the bureaucracy, he invented drip irrigation. Everybody here knows what drip irrigation is in a water form, and just to, only came about in the 1950s, invented in Israel because of the low cost of plastics. Before plastics became available, it would not have been a viable technology. In 1965, the Netafim Corporation, a very poor kibbutz in Israel called Hatzirim, this guy invented this drip irrigation. He went to a wealthy kibbutz called Yod Fatah, also in the south of Israel, and said, I got this great idea, drip irrigation. They said, we got this dairy, we're making chocolate milk, pudding, find some other sucker to buy this. And this other poor and starving kibbutz was about to go bust, and they said, well, we got nothing to lose. And today they are the primary stockholders in a major hundreds of millions of dollars corporation that makes this. And this is the most recent figures that I got, $750 million in sale, 3,000 employees. It's used worldwide. It raised the best news for marijuana growers in California as well as in orange groves in Florida. Israel thinks it's great. It improves benefits. It preserves the soil. It allows you to irrigate on steep landscapes. You can bring water directly to the root zone. You control it for computers. It slices and dices. It's a great thing. So that's one major contribution which allowed us over the past several years, like I said, to keep the amount of water to agriculture steady. But in fact, the fresh water is about a tenth of what it used to be, because now over half the water to agriculture is coming from recycled sewage. And our yields have gone up 14 times because drip irrigation does that better. The second thing we're starting to do is dealing with the problem of leakages. One of the problems in the Middle East is the fact that if you go into a major city in most Arab countries like Amman or Bethlehem or Damascus, about 50 to 60% of the water that is so scarce is literally, pardon the expression, pissed away by a system which is heavily leaking. Israel has developed technologies which now mean that we lose less than 10% of that. Here's one company, Luzon, which uses the advanced thermal photography to identify loss of water, and we both penalize cities that have more than 10% loss and give grants to cities that don't. And yet, still, we don't have enough water. We still need to get people to use less. And so this became very, very clear in 2009 when we were in the midst of a very intense drought cycle and the desal had not kicked in yet. And you can see here an interesting graph of Israel's demand for water over the months of the year in different years. 2006 is the black line, okay? You can see that. And you can see in 2007, the green line, how much water has been used. And take a look at 2009. Considerably less water. These are the months of the year. You can see water goes up in the summer months, in June, July, whatever. What's going on that allows this water to be so reduced, okay? It was a campaign by the government. What happened is that the government tried to impose regulations on cities and said you can't irrigate during the daytime and can't wash your cars. And the city government said this is unfair. You're giving all this water to agriculture. 97% of Israelis live in towns and cities. And they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court disallowed the regulation. All that was left was to talk to the Israeli people and try to convince them to use less water. That was all they could do. And here's, by the way, the numbers you can see is actually the drop per month. It's January, as in the winter months, you can see how these lower levels kicked in. Now, according to all theories of water economics that I've seen, water is always characterized as an inelastic resource. If you raise the price, people are still going to use water, at least at the municipal household level, because it's not something which they are very affected by. And as a father of 3 daughters, I can tell you, as much as I would yell up and say, you know, Zoe, get out of the shower. The Kinneret is going empty. She's still going to take, she's 14 years old, she's going to take her 15-minute shower. It's not a way you can affect that. That is the operating assumption of water economics. And yet Israel got this drop. So what was going on? Well, like I said, there was a serious campaign. Israel had a secret weapon, and her name is Bar Rafaeli. For those of you who subscribe to the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated, you may be familiar with our supermodel. And here she is in a water campaign asking Israelis not to drink water. I don't know how much it affected the female population, but every Israeli boy from age 15 to 35 said, okay, I won't shower for a month. And Bar Rafael was asking me to do that. But we did have a very serious campaign. And as a result of that, we had a rejection. I do want to say a bit about the regional implications and the hope that Israel's water management possibly gives us who are concerned about peace in the region. Because up until now, water has always been a zero-sum dynamic. In the first round of peace talks that was initiated by Secretary of State James Baker in 1992, talking to people who negotiated, it was a very, very unproductive discussion. The Israelis said, you know, the Palestinians said, you're stealing our water, give it back. And Israel said, we're not stealing your water, we have historic rights, and you should be making more. And it was a very, very, all of a sudden now when water can be produced, again, for 50 or 60 cents for 1,000 liters, we can look at this somewhat dispassionately and get beyond the hydro-hysteria that doesn't say, how can we work together to produce water? So the Palestinians are not enamored thus far of desalination. They say it will create dependence on Israel. They don't want to be vulnerable. They think it's too expensive for their agriculture. And they say it's temporary. You know, plants can go down. If you look at the sewage treatment plants in the West Bank, you'll see that many of the water infrastructure projects don't operate very well. But the truth of the matter is that in a town like Gaza, especially now, there's no question they are going to have to move to a desal reality. There's already a plant that is there, which Israel did not bomb during the recent attempt, but it only provides water for 75,000 people. We got to provide water for 2 million people. Their aquifer is completely salinized. It was after Egyptian occupation before 1967. It was already beyond that. So that's something we have to do. But it's easier said than done. To do that, you need a strong electricity supply, you need a water delivery system. Recently, we're seeing the first new rounds of agreements with regard to water resources. Here you have a picture of Israel's Minister for Regional Cooperation, the Jordan Minister of Water, and he was just recently unceremoniously dismissed, but the Palestinian Minister for Water, Shabbat, and they reached the agreement, which for the first time allowed Israel to give more water from the Sea of Galilee to Jordan by getting more water from Jordan's new desal plant, which Israel will build in Aqaba. And the brine will be pumped up to the Dead Sea. And this is a new system. You can see the schematic. I think this came from the Huffington Post, where Israel will take water from Jordan and send it back up here, and the Palestinians will get a little bit more as well. So this is an article that I wrote there also saying that it will not solve the problem completely because Jordan got all of 80 million cubic meters of water. There should be a million there, which was 10% increase in their water supply, which is great, important, and essential. But when your population is growing at 2% a year, you can count on one hand how many years it's going to take for that 10% increase to be neutralized. So when you're dealing with such a scarce resource, and you take a look at the geometric growth in population size, it's running on a treadmill. You're never going to catch up, okay? It's like sort of the Sisyphus who's pushing the rock up the wall, and the rock is falling down, and that force pushing the rock down is overpopulation, and we're going to have to start dealing with that if we're going to do that. But there is growing amount on this issue of desalination of cooperation, where Israel offers courses both to Palestinians and Jordanians about how they're going to work this, because this new technology has to be part of the solution. Here you have a picture from Jordan of the refugee plant that they made for the Syrians, and their water crisis, which was bad before the Syrian war, just got 1 million people worse. And these are serious, serious problems which only technology can solve. So I do think that ultimately, if we're going to have water to bring back the Jordan River, save the Dead Sea, it's going to have to be a combination of this management alongside the kind of technological innovation we've seen up until now. And here's a vision of peace for the Naharaim water park on the Jordan River, which we hope will be there. So I do believe, my last slide, the trend is not destiny. And what Israel's shown in its 65 years of trial and error, we've made no shortages of mistakes, is that perhaps we do have problems in the world of water scarcity and natural resource shortages, but water is one which we can overcome. Thank you.